You're listening to the Patenting for Inventors podcast, part of the Look Legal Pods from the law firm of Nolan Hyman, the #1 source for your intellectual property, business, and entertainment law needs. Now here's your host, registered patent attorney, Adam Diament.
Hello and welcome to the Patenting for Inventors podcast. My name is Adam Diament, a registered patent attorney and partner at the law firm of Nolan Hyman in Los Angeles, California. Most of my episodes are just me talking for about 5 to 15 minutes, some aspect of patent law, but occasionally I'll bring on a guest on a bonus episode who will talk about something related to patents, but my guests aren't patent attorneys themselves. This is the first time I'm bringing on a guest to actually talk about patents, and the reason I decided to not do it myself is that even though I've been a patent attorney for over 15 years, there's one niche area of patents that I've never done, and that's plant patents. So in this episode, I brought on another registered patent attorney, Dr. Dale Hunt, who's an expert in getting protection for plants. We talk about plant patents, plant variety protection certificates, what kinds of plants can and can't be patented, and how people actually make money off their plant patents, and what's the process of getting a plant patent. So I hope you enjoy this 7th bonus episode from the podcast, where I have a conversation with Dale Hunt, founder of Hunt IP Law, about intellectual property related to plants. All right, I have on my show this week a special guest, Dale Hunt, and we have an interesting background, and Dale probably doesn't remember from when I met him a long, long time ago. It was 1994, and I was taking Bio 1A at Berkeley, and he was my...
I do remember that.
Yes,
I do.
He was my TA, and I thought it was very strange because most TAs would be a graduate student in biology, but Dale was in law school, and he already had a PhD. Was it in genetics or plant biology? What was it in?
It was molecular and cellular biology, but I had done it in a plant system.
Okay. And I was like, what is this guy doing? This is crazy. He already has a PhD and now he's in law school. And then years later, I ended up following, almost an identical path where I got my PhD in genetics and then decided to go to law school. So we've kept in touch, sporadically throughout the years because we've had the similar pathways. Why don't you just kind of start out telling us about your background and how you got into plant patents?
Yeah, I'd love to. So as an undergrad, I was studying physics, had to take an extra class one semester to keep my scholarship. And I didn't find anything that fit my schedule except a botany class. So I kind of reluctantly took a botany class, and it fascinated me in a way that no other class ever had. So after the third session of that course, I changed my major and I never looked back. Loved every botany class I took. And then I stuck around there and did a master's in genetics. And by then I was really into it and decided to get a PhD. So I went to UC San Diego to do a PhD. And I wasn't totally committed to studying plants at the time. I just wanted to get into molecular biology because it was really hot at the time. And I guess it still is. But I ended up in a plant lab. So I studied protein targeting and developing seeds and did a lot of work with transgenic tobacco. And then by the time I was maybe 4 years into my PhD, I was pretty sure that I always wanted to be doing something with science, but I didn't think I wanted to be a professor. So I started looking at some other options and realized that law school, that certainly patent law especially, promised an interesting combination of science and law, and that patent attorneys use their science all the time. And I thought, well, that's a great way to stay current in science but not be as focused and as narrowly stuck in one little channel of the kind of research I was doing in my PhD. So I applied to a bunch of law schools, got into some good ones. Berkeley seemed like a great fit. So I went there and I loved law school. Got a summer job with a patent firm and loved that. And I really, it's hardly an exaggeration to say I've loved every day of my job since 1996. There are some days when you've got partner meetings and things like that are harder to love than others, but I love being a patent attorney, and you'll know this too, because we get to learn new things all the time. It's like being paid to still be a student in some ways. But we also get to solve problems and teach people. We teach our clients about the law. We teach patent examiners about a new technology. And so I just love it. When I started, the first firm I was at had just landed a a kind of a big agricultural plant breeding client, and they took over a plant patent portfolio that was in progress, but whose original attorney was retiring. And since I was a plant guy, they just assigned that to me. And so just kind of perusing the files and taking over these cases, I learned plant patenting just kind of by doing it. And I've been doing it as some part of my practice since 1996. Along the way, I've worked with lots of different kinds of plants, and worked in probably between getting plant rights and licensing the plant rights. I've probably done that in 30 different countries. One of the more interesting things lately is the fact that I do a lot of this in cannabis, but surprisingly, perhaps it's pretty much the same in cannabis as it is with any other kind of plant variety. So that's a pretty long answer to a simple question. I'll stop there and see if there's anything that I've left hanging that I should address.
Yeah, so plant patents are kind of a niche within a niche. Patent attorneys are their own niche already. And, I've had over 100 episodes of my podcast, and it's always been on my list of things to do, but I've actually never done a single plant patent just because they're so different, and I had no, background or mentorship in that. And the reason why I connected with Dale is that, I said, it's finally time to do this episode. I started writing it out, and there are a few questions I had, and I emailed him, and he said, well, why don't we just get on a call and I'll talk to you about it. And I thought, let you guys hear it from an expert yourselves. And so that's kind of how we got connected here. From the stats that I saw, plant patents make up what I saw is about 0.3% of patent applications. So they're, not, I would say most patent attorneys never have even done one, including myself. So maybe you could talk about, why is there a difference? Why are there plant patents? How are they different than the other two, which are people know much more about, which are utility patents and design patents?
Yeah. It's interesting that the plant patent system started back in the 1930s when plant breeding became a commercially pretty important area. And it was pretty evident that the traditional patent system, the utility patent system, just didn't work for plant varieties. Part of that is that, as you know, in doing a utility patent, you need to describe the invention on paper in such a way that someone can pick up that piece of paper, that issued patent, and they can make and use the invention without undue experimentation just by how it's written. And it's utterly and literally impossible to describe a plant patent or a new plant variety on paper in such a way that someone could read that paper and go make that variety because of the genetic uniqueness of that individual. And so Congress recognized that, hey, this is an important industry. The United States is leading the way in many ways in plant breeding, and we need to be able to protect the work of plant breeding companies so they'll have an incentive to keep doing it, and individual plant breeders. And so let's establish a system that works for plants. Now, for historical reasons, and maybe just to keep things focused on where the industry aligned with what was feasible, the statute was written in such a way as to be limited to asexually reproduced plants, meaning plants that are produced from cuttings or things like that. Not so that the plant patent system doesn't protect plants that are reproduced by seeds. That came later under the Plant Variety Protection Act, which is administered by the USDA, and we can get into that. But the plant patent statute is really limited to things like cut flowers, trees and vines, turf grasses that are propagated asexually, lots of different kinds of fruits. So it's anything that you can propagate asexually is covered, can be covered by a plant patent, and anything that is propagated by seeds cannot be.
Now, I see that in the statute they do have this exception for tubers and I think some other things. I was trying to read up on, why that is. I was never really satisfied with those answers. What's your understanding of that little carve out for things that you're not allowed to do?
I think it's a historical issue more than anything.
Going into like kind of the sexual versus, asexual reproduction, not many people I could kind of geek out about with genetics and patent law. So you're one of the few people. So it's protecting asexual reproduction. But there are things like, for example, one of my favorite apples is the Honeycrisp apple. And when I was looking into that, there was a plant patent on that. And plant patents, do they last 20 years like utility patents? Is that
yes.
correct? Okay.
Yes.
So there are seeds in there. So what's the story? It seems like, well, can't you just plant a seed from a Honeycrisp and get a new Honeycrisp? Is that patent infringement? Does it not work? Or what's the story there?
You could definitely plant a seed from a Honeycrisp and it would not be an infringement. But what you would get, that seed is half Honeycrisp and half whatever the pollen parent was. And even if it happened to self-pollinate, and I don't happen to know whether apples always self-pollinate or ever do, but even if it self-pollinated, it would not be the same genetic combination. As you know, the only things that are genetically identical the only humans that are genetically identical are identical twins. Even if you have, if you have a mother and father that have a lot of children, every one of those children is unique, just like every seed in that Honeycrisp apple is going to be genetically unique. So the only way to have a real Honeycrisp is to take an asexual cutting that is essentially a twin of the original Honeycrisp. And because plants can reproduce in that way, you can have essentially an infinite number of potential copies of the original Honeycrisp variety. So the way this works is that a plant breeder does a sexual cross, and probably a whole series of sexual crosses, to get an individual that has all the traits they're looking for. And once they have that individual, that is the new variety that they'll be patenting. And then the next thing is to propagate it asexually to make sure that it remains consistent across multiple iterations of asexual propagation. And if it is consistent, then it qualifies for protection as a plant patent. But if you reproduce that sexually, like taking the seeds from a Honeycrisp, you're not getting the next generation won't be the same as the tree that it grew from.
Okay, interesting. There is something in the I forget if it's in the statute or if it's in other legislation, that it has to be from a cultivated area. So it can't just be that some farmer just goes out, or you're out in the desert and you find something new. Can you talk a little bit about, that whole aspect of getting a patent and what that means?
Yes, I love that question, and I'm glad you noticed it. As you know, the patent statute says that you cannot. It has there's some unpatentable subject matter, and that comes partly from the patent statute and partly from or not patent eligible subject matter. It comes partly from court cases, but you can't patent a product of nature. There has to be some human intervention that leads to or contributes to the thing that is being patented. And so let's suppose we have a farm, we've got our 40 acres or our half acre or our greenhouse or something, and we find something on that farm or in that greenhouse that we didn't breed intentionally, but that popped up. Because that is in a cultivated area, even if we didn't intentionally breed it, if we notice it and it's different and we propagate it, that's still eligible for a plant patent. But if I'm out hiking and I find something really cool and I've never seen it before and I think it's unique and I try to patent that, if I'm honest with the patent office and admit that I found it in nature, it would not be eligible for patent because it'd be a product of nature.
Okay. And maybe we can just kind of go through the process of, are the type of people who are getting plant patents, are these mostly kind of universities or research places that are trying to specifically get certain traits, or are they kind of random farmers? What's the process that, is typical of when, someone's interested in, I don't know if it's that they're interested in getting a plant patent, or they just usually notice something interesting and unique and they're like, why can't I should be able to profit off of this, or kind of give me some examples of that type of thing?
Yeah, I think the most common kind of plant patent applicant is a company that is in the business of developing new varieties, and they're in the genetics business. And I've worked with lots of fruit companies that have one or more plant breeders on their staff. And for example, I worked with a grape company that, is grapes and stone fruits in California. They had one plant breeder that would do lots of crosses every year. He would identify in consultation with the marketing people what the traits were that they thought were not being well met in the market, what the demand was in the market that wasn't being met by the current supply of genetics. And he would try to create new combinations, either, let's say, a grape that doesn't shake off the bunches easily in transport, or one that is larger and firmer than the other ones, or one that might ripen a week earlier when the prices are high, or all kinds of things, sweeter or crunchier, all kinds of traits like that. The breeder finds parents that have some of these traits and does a lot of crosses, and then There's this with grapes, especially seedless grapes, especially, is an interesting process called embryo rescue, where when you do that cross, even with seedless grapes, there is this little trace of an embryo inside the fruit, and you take that embryo, culture it, get a new plant from it, and then in that process, they might plant out 1,000 or 10,000 of these seedlings, these rescued embryos, to see which ones grow vigorously and display some of the kinds of traits they want, and then they'll just mercilessly cull out almost every one of them, except the ones that really are outstanding and special. And over the course of maybe, definitely multiple years of cultivation and selection, and more cultivation and more selection, they might, if they're lucky, they might get something that's really going to be commercially successful. So after all that investment, in many cases, it was 10 years of breeding and selection to get something that they wanted to patent. Then they would apply for the patent. So that's at one end of the spectrum, is a company that is in the business of making great genetics and then licensing them all over the world. And that certainly pays for the R&D, because the patents make it possible to license all over the world. But at the other end of the spectrum, I've certainly worked with individuals that are just kind of hobby breeders, and then they come up with something that they think is pretty special, and someone's interested in obtaining it or growing it or selling it or something, and then they'll approach me and say, well, I think I might want to get a plant patent. What's involved? And then I explain that process to them. So I worked with the whole range, but certainly, because even plant patents, even though they're simpler and more straightforward than utility patents usually are, it's still, it's not a trivial cost. And so as a hobbyist, if you just think it'd be cool to have a plant patent, unless it's going to pay for itself, it's probably not a good idea. But there are individual breeders who do find things that have enough value that it makes sense to patent them.
When do most people kind of approach an attorney to help them, in terms of, is it very different from, are you involved right in the beginning if it's a big, company, so you're involved right away, or is it really only when they have, that final thing they like? And the kind of reason I'm asking is in utility and design patents, we have that 12-month bar. I actually don't know if that applies to plant patents, but that says if it's been out in the public or you're selling it for more than a year, you can't get a patent on it anymore. And I can see that kind of being an issue, perhaps for some individual growers who maybe are going to farmers markets, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, maybe I should patent this, and then maybe it's too late. Is that same type of statutory bar involved?
It is, but it's got an interesting twist to it. The definition, the thing that you claim when you get a plant patent is the variety itself, not the fruit of the variety, but the whole variety itself. And so if the plants, if whole plants or propagating material of that variety have been available to the public for more than a year, then they've lost their novelty. They're not eligible for patent anymore. But if, let's say, you've been trialing, you've been selling the fruit, you've kept complete control over the plants, but you've been testing to see how much people like the fruit, or maybe you've just been selling the fruit for a while. In the U.S., those plants themselves would still be fully eligible for patenting. I'll give you an example of this. It's one that kind of shocked me, but I was speaking at the Marijuana Business Convention in D.C. in about 2019 or it must have been 2018. And I realized I wanted to be sure that I had this right. So I called the supervising patent examiner at the USPTO, and I asked him, I said, let's suppose, because this is a fact situation that happens a lot in cannabis, let's suppose somebody's been selling harvested material. They've been selling flower for 30 years, but they've always kept the plants themselves. Nobody's ever had those plants. So the plants have still not been available to the public at all, ever, but harvested material has been out there for a long time. I said, to me, it seems like that plant per se is still hasn't lost its novelty. And the patent examiner agreed. He said, no, it is, if the plant as an individual, as a propagatable organism has not been available to the public, then it still has its novelty. No. So now that wouldn't be the case if you try to get a utility patent on it, because, well, at least you couldn't claim the things that have been sold for more than a year, like the fruit. But yeah, it's availability of the plants to the public.
Okay. And you did mention novelty, and novelty is a big thing in utility and designs. as well as obviousness. But it seems like for obviousness, it's kind of wouldn't be able to work the same way in plant patents because what is obvious? There's going to be, many different features. Does an examiner ever say, well, you described it in this way, and this is pretty close to this other plant, so, it's obvious. I can imagine it's not like that. So is that a factor at all? Or what are also kind of going along with that? If a plant patent application is rejected, what are usually the main reasons why?
Oh, I love these questions. So I'll take the first one, and if I forget to answer the second one, just ask it again. But to this day, 28 years or so into practice, I've still never had an obviousness rejection for a plant patent, at least not a serious one. And it is you've correctly deduced that. How would one genetically unique individual make some other individual obvious? You could study me as thoroughly as you wanted to, and it wouldn't make either of my brothers obvious. You could never say, well, then Marcus is going to look like this and David is going to look like this. And that's not how it works. So there's no way for one genetically unique individual to make another genetically unique individual obvious. Now, there is at least a theoretical risk of obviousness, and that is that if you can't put your finger on any way of distinguishing a new variety from a known variety, even if the patent office takes you at your word that you really did breed and select this, if you can't distinguish it in any way, you may get an obviousness rejection, and that may be legitimate. Of course, if you can't distinguish it, the other question is, why are you trying to patent it in the first place? So right. Usually those kinds of things just shake out in the process of evaluating what you should try to patent. And then the other question you had was, I'm forgetting it now.
If they are rejected, what are the main reasons that it would be rejected?
Yes,
the obvious isn't one of them. So what would it be?
Right. The patent statute requires that the plant patent statute requires that the disclosure describe the plant variety as thoroughly as is reasonably possible. I don't think that's the exact wording of the statute, but it's pretty close. And so I was just looking at a rejection just today, where the examiner said, you've described these features satisfactorily, but I would like to know, the exact color of this particular of the leaf of this plant, and I need a comparison to this commercial variety that seems pretty close. I need to understand what's different. I need to know what temperature these were grown at that produced this particular combination of, this happened to be cannabis, this combination of cannabinoids and terpenes in these amounts. So the nice thing is, as you certainly, anybody who has done much with utility patents is aware that you can't describe the invention more thoroughly after you've already filed it in a utility patent, because that constitutes new matter. You're basically inventing after the filing date. But an interesting fact about plant patents is that describing something more thoroughly in an amended application does not constitute new matter, because since that invention doesn't really exist on paper anyway, describing it better doesn't mean you're reinventing it. It just means you're meeting the statute more thoroughly. And so there's a specific statute that says that it is not new matter to add to the description and describe it better than you originally did. So what we do when we get a rejection in the plant patent application is we actually provide a substitute specification that addresses all of the issues the examiner would like to see a more thorough description of. And so, for example, when we get this rejection, we've got to usually have a list of things that the examiner wants to see. We send that to the breeder. They send back everything they've got that is responsive to that. Sometimes they'll say it's just not the season for this, or something I see. I really do work a lot with a lot of things besides cannabis, but we work a lot with cannabis these days. And so in this particular case, the examiner wanted a better description of the male flower. And we said, this thing never, this one of the things that makes this plant special is, this particular variety special is that it almost never goes hermaphroditic, meaning it almost never makes male flowers. And so it's not feasible for us to describe the male flower because we've still never seen one. And that was acceptable to the examiner. If they said, traditionally they like to have a description of the male flower, but in this case, if it simply doesn't exist, it's not reasonable for them to ask it. And you can meet the statute of the most thorough, reasonable description. without providing something that isn't available and isn't reasonable. So another long, thorough answer to a simple question, but those are the kinds of rejections we see. And usually after one response to an office action, in almost all cases, unless that response is just not complete because of some problem with the availability of some critical information, in almost all cases, we'll get an allowance after one response.
Okay. So you talked about the, kind of description is kind of the main issue. Can you go into the various types of, everything that needs to be described about the plant? And I guess just the application in general. In general, we have that, there's a background section, there are claims, there's, drawings or photos. Talk a little bit about, how that looks in a plant patent application.
Yeah, happy to. So what's interesting about plant patents is somewhat like design patents, there's only ever one claim. And so it is essentially the claim reads something like the plant variety named a new variety of this particular plant. Let's say it's a grape, Vitis vinifera, named XYZ, substantially as herein described. And so that is the claim. And then I've never had a plant patent that didn't require photographs. I think it's a pretty standard requirement. Usually, you'd include at least 2 photos of the plant. Particularly, you want to visualize the distinguishing features. So, if you've got, let's say, a grape that is deep purple, or a plum that has black skin and red fruit, then you need if that's what you're describing it as being its best commercial trait, or the thing that distinguishes it from its parents or the closest variety, then you want to show that photographically. You certainly know that in a utility patent, if you try to include color photos, you've got to get a petition granted to be able to include color photos in a utility patent. But it's a standard feature in plant patents, and in fact, it's required that they be color photos and the color be as accurate as possible.
Now, I'm just curious on the when I've searched just a couple of plant patents, what I pull up is black and white. Is it available in color, or is everything that you actually see, as if I'm searching patents, black and white, and you have to go to the patent office to actually view it? Or can you see the color ones?
When the paper patent issues, it is in color. But yeah, as the patent office has transitioned to being fully paperless, I think the last part of that transition is plant patents, because it is not, since it's such as you pointed out, what is 0.03% or something, the patent office doesn't usually build its systems around the convenience of plant patent applicants and plant patent owners. In fact,
you still actually have to file on paper. I read you can't do.
Yeah, we have to.
Okay,
we have to file on paper. We have to mail them in. This is back. You remember the bad old days when maybe you don't, but we used to have to take things to the post office and put them in express mail, and then your postmark was your filing date. We still do that with plant patents. During COVID, there was this period when you could do some paper filing and then supplement it with mailed filing with mailed photos later. But I guess the patent office isn't especially equipped to receive electronically electronically receive color photos. That's got to change eventually, and I think they're working on changing it. And so then obviously also the published PDFs are in black and white, but somewhere in the patent office, in the original files, and certainly in the issued paper patent, the photos are in color.
All right, and then I think I read in the background section, they kind of describe the whole process of where they found it and all the stuff, and in terms of everything they're describing, like skin and the flesh of the fruit and size and all that stuff. Is that something that you kind of are actively involved with, or do you have a kind of a gigantic checklist with fill in the blanks that you send to the growers that help you out, or how's that whole process work?
Well, it's what's interesting about that is that it is different for every species. And so, the best way of describing a grape would not be remotely like the best way of describing a turf grass, for example. And so when we get a new species that we haven't worked with before, we actually go to the patent office's database and we look for a handful of the most recently issued patents for that species. And sometimes we're working with a species that's never been patented, and then we look for other things that are closest to it, just so we can see what are the features that the examiners want to see. But so, let's say a few years ago we did a blackberry for the first time, and it was several years ago, but we pulled up some blackberry patents. And we made kind of word process the whole thing to make a complete list of every single thing that any of these patents had described. We turned that into a questionnaire for our breeder and said, just fill this out as thoroughly as you can. If there's anything you just don't have, or that this thing that's not relevant here, just mark it that way. And send us some photos, and we'll get this filed, and then we'll see what the examiner still wants from us. And, the more thorough you are, the closer you come to describing it the way recently issued patents have been described, the better chance you have of getting a first action allowance. And we've certainly had some of those. But, even if you have a well-established set of things that are typically enough for to grant a plant patent, sometimes a new examiner or a particular niche of the market, they'll think that some other feature is now relevant, and they've got every right to tell you, look, I want to see this, and this before I'm going to allow this. And then you either supply that information to them, or you tell them why it's not a reasonable request, or why you can't supply that information. They're usually pretty reasonable. Sometimes they'll ask for something and you think, come on now, that's I've never seen that requirement before. You're really pushing it here. But you go back to the breeder and you ask them, can you give me this information? And if they can, then great. If they can't, then you explain why it's not reasonable, and usually you get through. But it is kind of a fun process to try to anticipate what the examiner is going to want to know. And then the other interesting thing about this is if you do have a hobby breeder that doesn't work with these things all the time, and doesn't necessarily have a heavy scientific training in botany and plant morphology and plant description, they really they spend a lot of time Googling, what the hell is a rachis? What is a stipule, and where do I find the ligules, and what is hirsute, and so there are all kinds of botanical terminology that, even though I have a degree in botany, I sometimes still have to look some of these things up because it gets very specific.
Yeah. So do you know? I would imagine that maybe that plant patents probably would have one of the highest allowance rates, just because it seems like even if you don't fill it out correctly, as long as you get all that information, it would go forward. Do you know offhand, the allowance rates for plant patents?
Yeah, I can tell you that in 28 years of doing this, we've never had a plant patent that didn't get allowed unless the client just changed their goals about pursuing it, or ran out of money or something. But everyone that we have tried to work towards allowance was allowed. There were a couple where there were some tricky issues around novelty that we had to address, but yeah, eventually the examiners are reasonable, and almost in a way, by definition, if you really did breed this and you did the selection, you've got novelty and you've got non-obviousness, and then it's just a matter of describing it well enough to meet the statutory requirement for that, and then there really isn't a reason not to grant a patent. So it's not a slam dunk. I always tell people, so far we've had 100% success rate. It doesn't mean that we always will, but we have. And I think it does make sense, though, that it really is a different animal, from, so to speak, from a utility patent, which is, to go back to the original question you asked, that's why it needed its own statute.
Right. So maybe we could talk a little bit about the money aspect of this. I could see that the individual grower, is kind of selling their own stuff, but if these big universities or research places, they're not out there, selling their own plants in some plant store that they have in their business. What is typically, in terms of licensing or all this kind of stuff, how are people making money off that whole process?
Well, I will throw out a factoid that I know I believe it was true when I read it. I don't know if this is still true, but if you think about all of the biotech inventions and all of the electronic inventions and all the chemical inventions that the whole UC system has ever created and licensed. And, the way that universities make their money from R&D is, well, one of the ways they make their money from patents, of course, is, well, new R&D discoveries get patented and get licensed to industry. But when I read this, and I don't know if it's still true, but the number one moneymaker from patent licensing for the entire UC system was strawberries. So yeah, let that settle in. There, it's interesting when you think of a farmer told me once. Well, he was a farmer. It was the owner of a big farm in the Central Valley. He said, we tried to expand, but if you want to expand in agriculture, you got two choices. You can, if you want to be worldwide in agriculture, you can either buy land and hire people all over the world, which is a massive headache, or you can have great plant genetics that people want to grow all over the world, and you license them. You get intellectual property protection. You license these plant genetics all over the world, and you sit back and collect checks.
So do they,
you don't really
get money kind of like on a per plant basis that they sell, or how does that work? And then is there oversight in the sense that it seems so easy for them to just kind of take a rootstock or take something and just kind of do their own thing, or is it policed well? Or are there stories of infringement that that are kind of scary for the grower?
I love these questions. So I've got a couple of war stories that'll be fun to share. So first of all, let's see. The one thing you need to know is that the rest of the world has a somewhat different system for plant IP protection. It's not it's outside the patent system. It's called UPOV, which is a French acronym that means essentially the International Union for Protection of Plant Varieties. That corresponds to the USDA's Plant Variety Protection Act. So it's an international convention. I think there are about 75 member countries. And so when I'm outside the U.S., I'm working with under the UPOV system, which is similar to but not identical to the plant patent system. And it also embraces both seeds and asexually propagated plants. But let's put that aside for the second and say that we've got some kind of a worldwide scheme for IP protection. We've got some plant varieties that grow really well. Let's use a California climate, and we're looking at maybe countries with a Mediterranean type climate. So in addition to the standard Mediterranean countries, we might also have some demand or some market potential in places like South Africa and Australia and other places like that. So we might get IP protection all over the place, and then license growers in those places to obtain some reproductive material and pay a royalty. The royalty can be measured on a per plant basis. You can charge a propagation royalty. You can also charge a harvest royalty. It really is a function of what is the easiest way to measure the value or the use of that plant in a particular space. And in some cases where the propagation is pretty expensive and there's a big commitment, like let's say it's a stone fruit, and that tree might be in place the entire life of the IP. You might charge a propagation royalty and a harvest royalty. So that's very much a function of the way you monetize a particular plant, and it can be really different, say with turf grasses or with timber trees, or various different kinds of plants that can be patented. As far as the policing goes, that's really an interesting thing too, because you might imagine, well, yeah, if you're growing these things, how is anybody going to know what it is? And if somebody just swipes a little bit of a patented plant and they grow it in their backyard, who's going to know? And the fact is, yeah, you don't know, but the kind of infringement that you would try to sue for anyway, because lawsuits are expensive, the kind of infringement that you would really care about is one that is hurting your own market for selling your variety. So to give an example, if I had a grape client and they've got somebody licensed to grow their grapes in, say, Morocco, and they're trying to sell them into stores in England. And then the buyers in England are saying, I don't want to buy yours. You're overpriced because I can get the exact same thing from South Africa. And you say, well, we haven't licensed anybody in South Africa. Let me see what it is you're buying from there. And you look at it and you say, this looks like our stuff. Somebody ripped us off in South Africa. So then you go, and this is based on a true story. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but it's based on a true story. You go, check the materials in South Africa and you say, "Gee, this looks suspiciously like our grape. Let's do a DNA test." And you do a DNA test, it is identical. That DNA test is dispositive. If you're looking at enough markers, and it doesn't take too many markers before you've gotten to the point that statistically there's no way it's not a copy. And then pretty soon you've got a slam dunk, open and shut infringement case, and it becomes just a matter of damages. And then it is, well, are we going to rip out every plant of this variety in this country, or are we going to make all these farmers licensees? And so that's one thing, that plant patent litigation is not a really an especially common thing. It does happen sometimes, but usually the infringement is fairly clear, and it does just boil down to damages. And unless there's a huge dispute about the damages, there is, these things get settled pretty quickly. Okay. And so it's a factor of you do the enforcement when the infringement becomes significant enough that your salespeople notice it.
Right. Okay. Now, you did mention that there are other ways to protect plants besides the plant patent. And I saw this thing called the Plant Variety Protection Certificates.
Yes.
How is that different, or what does that do?
Yeah, those are issued by the USDA, and they were in the US, the Plant Variety Protection Act was really meant to fill some gaps that were created by what the plant patent statute doesn't cover. So you could get USDA PVP certificates for things like seed propagated plants. And more recently, in the rest of the world, most patent offices didn't want to be handling living organisms, and either they had some public policy against it, that it wasn't just plants but mice or whatever. They didn't permit patenting of living organisms. But again, they recognized the importance to agriculture of protecting plant varieties and protecting plant breeding. So they came up with this international convention for the protection of plant varieties. And as I said, the 75 member countries, give or take. And when the U.S. joined, because there was already a plant patent system, the U.S.'s implementation of the standard convention on that was limited to the things that the plant patent statute didn't cover. Now, more recently, in the late 20 teens, I think around 2018, the USDA, the Plant Variety Protection Act was amended to permit the USDA to also receive applications for vegetatively propagated plants, asexually propagated plants. But essentially, in the UPOV system, the system you get what are called plant breeders' rights. And in the U.S., it'd be a plant variety protection certificate. And I'd say that the most important contrast between a PVP certificate or a PBR, plant breeders' rights, in the rest of the world is that there are a couple of important carve-outs that those rights do not cover. And one of them is that it's just as a matter of public policy when they developed the UPOV system, was they did not want the IP around plant varieties to hinder further breeding and developing of other new varieties and better varieties. So it is not an infringement of a plant breeder's rights or a PVP certificate to use the variety as a breeding parent to make other varieties, to develop other varieties. Now, if you're using a protected variety repeatedly to make an F1 hybrid, that isn't without a license. That is an infringement. But there's a breeder's exemption that lets you use a protected variety for further breeding of other varieties, and that's not an infringement. So that's an interesting difference. And then it's a difference between it's a carve out. It's also because the plant patent system you're only infringing a plant patent by doing asexual propagation. Breeding with a patented variety of plant is also not an infringement, but propagating to be able to have enough stock to breed with certainly would be an infringement. So one of the carve-outs under UPOV that PBR or PVP does not protect is breeding. The other one is saving. It's called the farmer's exemption, saving seed from 1 year's worth of crop to replant the same field. As the public policy there was, they didn't want the farmers to have to pay for IP protected seed year after year after year. And so they were permitted to save the seed under that. It's not, at least it's not an infringement of the IP right. Now, what's interesting about that is that many countries will still permit the owner of the PBR to contract out of that, to have contractual protections that fill those gaps. So they might say, we're only releasing this variety to you if you promise not to breed with it, and if you promise not to save seed. You have to buy new seed from us every year, and they'll dress it up as, well, we want to make sure the seed is still good, that it's fresh, that it's certified somehow. So while the IP may not be infringed by either breeding or saving seed, it still may be a violation of an agreement, of a conditional sale. So again, another long answer to a short question, but there are a lot of interesting wrinkles here.
Yeah, and maybe to confuse things even more is that I think you can also get protection for plants under utility applications if you're doing genetic engineering of plants. I remember, I could be wrong about this, but I mean, the big thing, I think it was the late 90s, early 2000s was Monsanto and their genetically engineered things. And there was it may have been tomatoes, the flavor saver, and other aspects of people saving seeds. I don't remember if that was also Monsanto. So in terms of, utility patents, is it basically if you're in a lab and creating something and adding individual genes, that goes the utility route. But if it's more kind of direct, classical breeding, then that's the plant patent route.
Well, very interestingly, yeah. When I give talks about this, I explain that in the U.S. there are three ways of protecting a plant variety. You've either got the PVP route, and it used to be limited to seeds, but it's not anymore. You've got the plant patent route, which is still limited to asexually propagated, and then you've got the variety specific utility patent. Of course, I'll explain the variety specific utility patent, but then I want to come back to the other utility patents that are more trait specific, such as with genetic engineering. But let's suppose, and again, cannabis is interesting here because it is one of the plants that can be propagated commercially either by seed or by cloning, by asexual propagation, depending on the variety and what you're doing with it. Are you planting acres and acres of hemp and you're harvesting the seeds? And you're definitely going to be doing seed propagation there. Are you making some really unique flower product that needs to be identical from one situation to the next? You're definitely going to do that by cloning. So, but let's say we've got a cannabis plant or some other plant that we want it to be an infringement to breed with it. And we want to be able to protect both the seeds and the clones. We want to be able to protect it in a way that is broader than a plant patent and also broader than a PVP certificate. Then you can have a plant, what we call, and this is not a term that the patent office uses, but we use it with our clients just to be clear about what kind of protection we're pursuing. We call it a variety specific utility patent, or a VSUP. And that is a utility patent whose claims are defined by a specific seed deposit, a specific exemplar of the variety. It could be a tissue deposit too, but it's as you know, when you are working with a biological organism that is impossible to fully describe in writing, the courts have ruled, and the patent office has certainly embraced this, that you can substitute for the failure to be able to write a full description of something or to enable it by supplying a biological deposit of that organism. And that deposit itself constitutes the written description and the enablement of the organism. So if we do a VSUP, the first claim says, the variety of tobacco as exemplified by seed deposit XYZ in this seed depository or whatever, the tissue depository. And then you can have other claims that might be, let's say, use of it in a breeding program, progeny having these characteristics. So you can still claim it in a variety of ways like you would with any other utility patent, but it's limited to the variety that you've put on to the specific genotype that you put on deposit. Or if it's not a clonally propagated variety, it's a seed variety, it's going to be a stable seed line that is consistent enough that the seed deposit you make is representative of the variability you'd see in that seed line. And then, so those are the ways that you'd protect individual specific varieties. But let's suppose to go to the question you really asked, which is, what about genetic engineering? What about when you're engineering not necessarily a new variety, but a new trait into a plant, and maybe that trait would be manifest across a variety of different background genotypes. So it wouldn't necessarily be just one selection that you're protecting. It might be any plant that contains this. And so that would be just a straight up utility patent. And you wouldn't necessarily need a biological deposit for that, because you could describe, let's say, the genetic modification, whether you're doing CRISPR or some kind of just more traditional old-fashioned genetic engineering. But you could describe how to do that genetic modification on paper. And if you could make that genetic modification to a variety of different backgrounds, or to multiple different backgrounds of host plant, then you wouldn't have to make a deposit of any of those. You could just say it could be any of these plants, any plant that is amenable to this type of engineering. And so that's where you go outside of protecting specific breeding results or specific varieties to protecting plant innovation, or genetically engineered plants, or gene edited plants, or things that are broader than one specific variety.
It sounds extremely complicated, which is why I don't dabble in it. It's not something that patent attorneys should dabble in, even if they're patent attorneys, and it's so specific. So we talked about so much here. I think probably the best way to end off is, if you happen to contact me, all I'm going about plant stuff, all I'm going to do is refer you to Dale. So Dale, why don't you give your contact information if people have questions on protecting their plants?
Great. Yes. Our firm is called Hunt IP Law. It used to be called Plant and Planet Law Firm, but since we do a lot of things besides plants, we rebranded this year. So even though you can probably still find us under Plant and Planet, the current website is Hunt IP Law. My address is dhunt@Hunt IP Law, and we'd love to hear from you.
All right. Well, it's been great talking to you. And
likewise.
All right. We'll be in touch again.
Okay. Thanks. Take care.
Right.
Thanks for listening to the Patenting for Inventors podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please kindly rate and review on your favorite podcast platform. The contents of this podcast are intended for general informational purposes only. The facts of every legal matter are unique, and the content of this podcast should not be construed as offering legal advice for your specific legal situation. For more information about how we can help with your own legal needs, check out our services at nolanhyman.com. That's NOLANHEIMANN.com. Or call Adam Diament directly at 424-281-0162. The preceding information may be considered an attorney advertisement and does not establish any attorney-client relationship.